Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Caitlin and I wanted to get started right on time. And I know that we'll probably have some people joining us as we kind of go over some housekeeping technological information. And I know we've got almost 40 people on so far. I think over 100 people are signed up. But I wanted to make sure that we got started right on time because I'm sure everyone has busy schedules. I am going to turn on my webcam here as well. I am actually here. Hello, good morning. All right, so we are going to be, as it says here, talking about integrating mental health strategies into workplace wellness initiatives. So I've been a clinician for over 10 years and I'm the head of the training department at Cascade Centers now, but I still do work with clients and I do a lot of education and teaching both with just leadership, just HR, and employees as well. But I really wanted this to focus, of course, on how can human resources and HR teams and individuals really consider and think about how mental wellness is integrated again into wellness initiatives. I think we're moving more and more towards that holistic look at what wellness means, but there's always, concrete things that we can try and things that we can do. But before I get into all of that, I just want to go over some sort of tech support suggestions. You may have been an attendee at GoToWebinar webinars before and you're very familiar with this, but you may be new to it. So there's a few things that are really important to kind of be aware of. The first thing I will say right off the bat is if you're having any technical issues, and hopefully you can at least see the screen. So if you can't hear me, you can read what I'm saying at the bottom. If you're having any technical problems on your interface, which would look like this little panel on the side of your screen, next to the word handouts, you're going to see that little white arrow. That's a drop-down arrow. And for yours, you'll see 3 separate PDF files, and one of them says Webinar Tech Support. If you are having any technical problems, please start there. That usually resolves everybody's issues. It walks you through steps to try to resolve any technological problems you may be having. So definitely download that if you're having any issues. While we're talking about handouts, as you can see, if you have looked at those, there are 3 total handouts. One of them is today's slide deck. So if you wanted the entire deck of slides that I'm going to present today, you're welcome to download that PDF as a resource for you. There are a lot of links on there, a lot of takeaway resources, so I would definitely recommend it. There's also an ERG toolkit, and sort of how to, and I'll talk a little bit more about ERGs in a bit, and you may be very familiar with what they are or not. But I found that toolkit and I found it very helpful, very concise, clear on steps if you are considering adding an ERG or more than one to your organization. So there's plenty of resources under those handouts. Those will be available to the extent that this is our live presentation. So that is where to find all that information. If you have questions for me, we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. And as it says up here, questions are anonymous. The way that questions work is that next to the word questions, you'll click that little white arrow again and you'll see this here and type in your question. Again, questions are completely anonymous. I'm the only one who sees who asked the question. No one else does. So when I answer questions, and of course I'll get to as many as I can, but when I do answer questions, I don't say who asked it. I just say somebody asked about, and I'll summarize what that question was. So it's always going to be anonymous. No one's going to see that you typed in a question, and no one's going to know that you're the one who asked it. I like to default to anonymity because for some people it makes them more comfortable to ask some of those questions, and as much participation, the better. So anything that can sort of eliminate any anxiety about participating, I try to do. I'm also going to do a few live poll questions as we go through here. Of course, they're completely optional. The more people who participate in them, the more interesting the results. But again, totally optional and completely anonymous. No one's going to know who even participated, let alone what they chose. So please participate in the polls if you are willing to do so. And we'll do a few of those as we go through here. So for the questions, I will leave some time at the end. If you have a question that comes up while I'm presenting, you can type that into the questions box. You may notice me kind of glancing over. That's because I'm keeping an eye on that questions box. So if it's something I can quickly answer right then, I will happily do so, or I'll wait till the end. So feel free to type those in if you do have any questions. Let's see if there's anything else in terms of housekeeping. Oh, the other thing really quickly, And this is pretty self-explanatory. There's a couple things. If you don't want this whole thing covering the side of your screen, you can click that little arrow and it'll minimize it. The other thing is that you may see a hand raise feature button, and I would avoid using that only because audience members are muted. And so if you raise your hand, the only thing I see on my end is that somebody raised their hand. I don't know why, I don't know who raised their hand. So don't use that, but I want to make sure that everyone feels like they can ask their questions and can participate and are not being ignored. So that's why I definitely type those questions into the questions box and not the chat. That can also be confusing, so don't type it into the chat, type it into those questions. All right, that's the fun housekeeping component that we got through. I can usually do it in under 5 minutes, so there we go, it's 9:05. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what are our objectives today? What are we talking about? And what I want to do is, again, try to be as concrete as possible. You know, when I walk away or step away or click away from this presentation, if you will, is there something I can do right away? And hopefully we will accomplish that. So some primary objectives, though, really thinking about emotional wellness and psychological safety, which I'll define here momentarily. What also drives employee engagement? You know, I think a lot of wellness initiatives are not only to promote wellness, but also to engage employees. And, you know, healthier employees physically, mentally, tend to be more engaged employees. And what is employee engagement? You know, that's different than someone who is just showing up to work and leaving. You know, how would we kind of define an employee who's showing up and an employee who's engaged? And there are different measurables, and I'll give kind of a list of what most employees who've been surveyed, you know, there's multiple kind of signs that we've seen of what helps employees feel engaged. It's really that two-way street. So how are we helping employees feel engaged? And today it's primarily around, you know, integrating that mental well-being piece. So thinking how, you know, how we move from they're just showing up to work and that's about it, to how are they engaged, and how do we really do that through not only that physical wellness, but also that mental wellness and that sense of safety for everyone. And then learning some strategies for implementation. And then I also have, like I mentioned before, and if you joined a little bit later, all of the slides for today's, all the slides I'm going through, if you click on that handouts tab on your interface, you'll be able to download this entire slide deck. I would definitely suggest that because there's tons of links and resources that I will offer to you. Well, there's only so much time, and so I like to just give you takeaways as well. All right. So if we're thinking about what our current landscape is, and I think, you know, we have, even before COVID, it was already, and I think probably a lot of us, you know, and a lot of you know this already, there really had been for a while, and this is a good thing, a shift towards understanding wellness, not just employee wellness, but in this frame, wellness as much more holistic than just physical wellness. And, you know, shocker, our brain is attached to our body. So that's part of our physical wellness. And our emotional state is also held in our physical body. And so it can lead to physiological distress, you know, through that tension, that ongoing stress, that ongoing burnout. It's all connected. And so the more we provide tools, provide interventions, provide strategies and support at our organization, that is not just only the sort of physiological wellness, but also the emotional. So we were already looking at that and trying to do more of that in organizations pre-pandemic. And as we probably all know, it has been very challenging for everyone, and that is a major understatement since the pandemic, dealing with adjustment, dealing with grief, dealing with loss, chronic anxiety, and that's for everybody. And then if we're thinking about individuals who have a history of mental health diagnoses or concerns, so as we're looking at some of the statistics here, you know, this is just some more recent statistics around percentages of employees who felt worse about the following issues, and, you know, 30% increase in anxiety, 20% increase in depression. But I also wanted to identify this one too, of this decreased enthusiasm. And I think we're seeing a lot of that, and it's been interesting, and probably you've seen it as well. You know, we kind of go through this process of kind of the stages of crisis. what is this? Everyone's trying to just figure out how are we even working now in a pandemic? How are we keeping everyone safe? Are we switching to remote work? Are we not? What's happening? And then it's been, 20 plus months and trying to figure out, is this a new normal? What is a new normal? What's happening? Every day is different with new information. And for a lot of people, this apathy sets in, this lack of enthusiasm, which is directly related, of course, to engagement. So the mental wellness initiatives were always important to integrate, but certainly particularly important now. And what's interesting too, and this, we'll talk about this as well, is the structure of a lot of the initiatives, certainly also the physical health initiatives, had to drastically change if suddenly your staff went remote. How are you doing those initiatives? So some of those types of activities, strategies that companies were using also stopped at this time, at the time that they were also needed most. And some of that was just logistically impossible. These things changed, people's work setup changed, but we're at a point now of trying to figure out now what, what were things that we can bring back? What are things we need to do differently? But we're seeing here in a very real way that employees are disengaged, they're more stressed, they're more anxious. And then as you can see here, and this is kind of an overall of a reminder of what we're looking at some of these statistics, 66% of employees feel better about their employer after using a mental health benefit. And almost essentially 60% of employers are not planning on offering any new programs. Again, this study was done last year. And 60% of employees said mental health support programs and benefits are important when applying for and considering a job. So it's not only, as we know, creating wellness in our current staff, it's thinking, how do we also think about this in terms of retention, in terms of recruiting, and as an HR standpoint, on that recruiting side, what are we offering? How do we offer these things in a measurable way that we can talk about, that we can promote, and that helps us recruit people and retain employees? So I mentioned earlier, employee engagement, and I'm not going to read this slide word for word. You can read it, but what I think is really helpful is there's this kind of multiple sides to the same coin here of what helps employees feel engaged. And a lot of this, again, starts with human resources, it starts with leadership, and it starts with organizational culture, essentially. And when I talk about some specific interventions to use, that's where we can get into the measurables around this. But everyone in today's training is from a different organization. That could be a huge number of employees, a super small number, it can be, private company, public, like there's so many different backgrounds and organizations you could be coming from. And so your version of answering some of these questions are going to look different on a measurable way. There can be underlying similarities, but thinking about, as you look through this list of, we have a strong culture, we have open, honest, two-way communication, employees feeling that they're rewarded fairly for their work, leadership, relationship with staff. So really thinking about, if you're looking at this list, how at my specific organization can I answer some of these? And if I were to say, I think that staff does trust senior leadership at my organization, the next question is, how do you know that? And if they suddenly didn't anymore, how would things look different? And I'll ask more questions like that. But the more you can specify your answers around this or any goals you're setting for your organization and make them as measurable as possible, the better. So I'm going to just do a live poll here real quick because I think it just helps to kind of jump in, get people engaged, and we've got probably most people who are going to join today have joined. So let's just start with this. All right, so I'm going to launch this poll and you should see that on your screen. So it's just asking you to answer, my organization already integrates mental wellness into its workplace wellness initiative. So just a yes or no answer. I'll give you a few moments to answer that. We already have about half of you voted, so I'll give it a few more moments. All right, I'm gonna give it 10 more seconds here. Okay, so we had 75% of you voted. Thank you for those of you who participated. Let me share the results here. So we've got about 75-25 or so. That's great that a lot of you already are. So this is wonderful. But I think it's kind of interesting just to start off because we have people from all sorts of different work sites to kind of see where we're at on that statistic. All right, so that is good to know. Okay, moving on. So when I talked earlier about how are we measuring this, so I always, when I talk to individuals, but also organizations as a whole, I try to always ask these open-ended questions, and I'll give you some examples of how we do that with staff too a little bit later. But this may seem obvious because the question would be, what do you mean my primary goal for implementing wellness? To have staff well. But there could be different reasons for it. There could be something specific to your organization, some catalyst that led you to think, I really want, to have more investment in specific wellness initiatives related to mental well-being. So it helps as HR and, as you're thinking about integrating these things, the more that we can have an understanding of why we're doing it, then we can get to a much clearer understanding of what those measurable outcomes look like. So, if we're thinking, I want to do that because we've had a lot of people struggling with mental health issues, and in many ways that can, it's time and retention issues, those types of things. So maybe we want to improve retention in our organization. Maybe we want to improve reduce the amount of sick days or days off that people are taking. Like, what are ways that we can help with preventative? So there could be any list of things, but the more specific you can get, the better. And that's where it's really asking, what number one is the reason that you want to implement wellness initiatives, mental wellness initiatives? And then how would you notice that it had been achieved? So is it that less people are quitting? That's a measurable outcome. What are ways that you can say, these initiatives we've done work, we've put into place, we've continued to maintain, here's how they have improved our organization. And the better you can get at specifying that, if suddenly our mental wellness had completely improved tomorrow, how would the organization look different? How would staff interact differently? What would that look like differently in terms of how I interact with staff, what they're coming to me about, the issues, etc. So starting there is always so important. And that may be, again, this depends on your size of your organization. You may have a whole HR team that's working together thinking, what do we want to implement? Why do we want to implement it? And what are our measurable outcomes we can track on if it's working or not? And figuring that out. It might just be you or a team of HR and determining that. All right, I'm going to jump right into another poll question because I think it's also helpful, because a lot of times with trying to change or do things differently in an organization, there's going to be some barrier to that. Otherwise, we'd all just be doing it immediately and be working perfectly. And wouldn't that be great? So there's always barriers. These don't necessarily mean, that there's something good or bad about them. Barriers are just things to be aware of and think, how might those show up and what are some ways that I can mitigate those? So I want to just kind of jump in and see where people are at on this. So let me see here. All right. So I intentionally left off other because I think sometimes everyone will just click other. And I really want you to think about, and I know it's hard because it may be that you have a lot of them that you feel similarly about, but do your best to choose the one that you're most closely, if you have one, that is or you think could be a barrier for you or your team or your organization. And we've got about 60% of you voted. Again, I'll give it about another 10 seconds. Okay. All right, we had 80% of you voted this time. We've got pretty interesting results. Let's see what we've got. Okay. All right, so understandable. I thought maybe there might be some for unsure what the interventions would be. I will do what I can, try to assist with some of that. But then we can see, and I'm not surprised by this either. It takes a lot of time to even sit down and implement things or figure out how to integrate those things into the workday for ourselves and for the staff. But I'm really interested too, because I specifically put leadership buy-in because this can be a really big piece. Is everybody on board? And what are some ways that we can, try to support this? And I think as HR, really seeing it, and I think you already do, but through a lens of retention, of cost saving, as we all know. And there are ways to kind of frame this as a holistic approach of helping staff helps us, helps everybody. So, but I wanted to kind of get an idea where people are at. So that's definitely kind of an interesting breakdown. And of course, cost can be one too. All right. Here we go. Okay, so what are we doing here? So psychological safety, this is kind of just a quick definition of it, but essentially the ability to be oneself without risk of negative consequences or judgment. So a lot of times, again, our mental wellness is going to be very affected by whether we feel safe at work or not. And, when we're thinking about mental wellness, that safety goes beyond just physical safety. There's also a sense of social safety and psychological safety. So thinking, if I share a different opinion than my supervisor, how are they going to respond to that? Am I respected in team meetings? All of these things. How is communication? How effective is it? Are emails communication appropriate and supportive, whether we're in person or virtual? If someone, makes a mistake, how do others respond? So a lot of this all comes with psychological safety. And it is one of the biggest indicators of when you see someone that is not an engaged employee, because if an employee does not feel psychologically safe, then they're just going to sort of go to work and leave. Like, I'm going to do the bare minimum, put my head down, and that engagement goes down because there's a lack of safety there. So a lot of this is being aware of, how do we maintain that safety? And today, again, this could be a very long conversation about that, but today really it's focused on preventative, ongoing mental wellness initiatives that I think can really, as human resources, demonstrate to employees that you see that that's incredibly important. What I would say is one of the biggest things that I think is also a major barrier. So I'm coming up with my surprise 5th barrier that we didn't talk about already, is finding out what staff actually want. So often, and I see this all the time when I consult with human resources or I consult with leadership or both, is they have an idea of what will help employees feel more mentally and emotionally well, and the employees have an idea of what will help them feel more emotionally and mentally well. And it is bridging that gap. And a lot of times, whether it's intentional or not, the people putting together the wellness initiatives tend to possibly think they know what employees want or will help them feel better, and it's not exactly that. So what I cannot stress enough, I know I'm using stress here, is ask your staff what they need. And I'm going to give you lots of resources around how to do that, because there are better, more productive ways of asking that. And I've seen so many times, time and again, that companies put in lots of time, lots of money to wellness initiatives without having ever surveyed their staff about what they need to feel well, physically, emotionally, etc. So we will sometimes make all these assumptions, we'll put in all of this work and think to ourselves, we did all these initiatives, we did XYZ, and engagement isn't still really happening, we're still dealing with retention. And so we've done all this work and it didn't work. And I wish I could tell you the amount of times in a consultation I've said, did you ask your staff what they wanted? And there's sometimes a long pause, and they'll say, well, so please start with asking them. And the other thing I would say, because I'm going to give you suggestions on kind of company-wide questions, and then also in the moment if someone comes to you. So we'll talk about that more. But if anything is a takeaway from today's training, this should be it. Ask them what they need. So then there's also, and we'll get back to that, not to worry, but a few other things on here is with mental wellness, it's also making sure how often have we reiterated to staff on a regular basis, because I think a lot of companies, assume staff know this, but it's good to remind them that bullying, harassment are not tolerated at the organization. Make sure that staff know exactly what the policy is if they are experiencing that or there's anything that they need to report, so they are comfortable with understanding the procedure around that. And then also understanding, how if employees know what to do if they're having a mental health crisis or if they're concerned about another employee. So that is something I think that can be really helpful, is ongoing reminders and conversations with staff. It demonstrates that you not only are serious about psychological safety, and also serious about making sure that you are there to tell them that you support their mental well-being. So these are conversations I think, again, we forget to have, but all of this is not one and done. We gave them, one email or brought it up once in a meeting. It's an ongoing reminder. So the more that we can remind staff of that, where to access policies and procedures if they need to. And to speak to that a little bit, this is also a good reminder that since the pandemic, your workplace circumstances and logistics may have changed dramatically. And it's interesting as an EAP, someone who works at an employee assistance program, is pre-pandemic, I'd have someone call and say, hey, I saw your, business card hanging on a cork board in our lunchroom. That's not happening, as much anymore, because people are not packing into a lunchroom at their workplace really very often. A lot of people are working remotely. And so my question always to organizations is, how are you reminding people about the mental wellness resources they have outside of, internally at their organization, which of course also remind them of that. But if you have an employee assistance program and suddenly staff are working remote and they used to be working in person, and you had flyers up or posters or pamphlets, how are those reminders getting sent out? Are you bringing it up in meetings? Are you sending email reminders with that information? Because as I'm sure you all know, staff will very rarely go to you and say, do you have the number for that again? Because they may be worried about stigma. Again, it may or may not be a psychologically safe environment, just in general, or there may be some anxiety about asking for that. But if you preventatively, proactively provide that information to people, they will use it more. So having an understanding and a strategy around how are we reminding people of their resources if our workplace logistical setup has changed. Okay, so survey question examples. This is just a few. On one of the very last slides, there's a link to a website that has 70 questions, all questions to ask employees. So this is 7 out of 70 that I just grabbed from the list. And it is an excellent resource because we can talk all day, but it's like, what do I ask? With surveying employees, like I said, this is my #1 goal of today's training. Ask them what they need, but also ask better questions. Because what happens so often is sometimes I will ask HR leadership, have you asked staff what they need? And they'll say, yeah. And I'll ask them to tell me, how did you do that? What did that look like? And it either wasn't anonymous or it was a closed-ended question. And I think some of them on this list are closed-ended, but I tried to make sure most of them were not. And on this next slide, don't worry, I'll come back to the slide we were just on. I'm not rushing past it. But this question right here, how's everything going? Everyone doing okay? So that may be a one-on-one question, or it may be something in a staff meeting. What are most people going to say? Yeah, everything's fine, when it's not. Because it's almost a leading question. You good? Everyone fine? Okay, great. We asked everyone how they were doing. They're doing great. Good to go. But the problem is, and I'll get back to that one too, but I just wanted to jump to that slide really quickly, is it's also how to ask it. And this goes back to psychological safety. Are we surveying staff in a way that provides them a psychologically safe space to answer those things accurately? #1, do it anonymously. And there are a million different online survey programs that you can upload your questions to, and make sure it's anonymous, make sure that everybody is surveyed, and make sure that they know in bold type that this survey is truly anonymous, and make sure that it is, because this goes back to what makes employees feel engaged at work. They trust senior leadership. So that'll be a really good indicator. Do they trust you when you say this is truly anonymous? Do they trust human resources? So make sure that it is. And then the thing that's interesting is that for the people, adding these surveys, is a lot of these are open-ended questions, sort of essay answers, but that's going to give you better information instead of, is everything working okay? Yep, everything's fine. But which moods do you feel mostly at work? What do you struggle with most at work? And, how do you manage your feelings when you're unhappy at work? What are things that we as a company can do to prevent mental health for our employees? And have it be short answer. And this, again, requires more time on the people gathering the survey information. But when we ask open-ended questions, it requires an answer. So instead of just, do you feel burnt out or not? What would help you feel less burnt out is a much better question to get you accurate information. And someone had asked too, how do we verify employees have taken the survey if it's anonymous? Typically, I would have that survey be optional. And so, but I realize, every organization is different, but, normally I would say this is an optional survey. It is completely anonymous. So the more feedback we get, the better. Here's why we're doing it. Here's, we want to make sure everyone feels like they can answer it however they're comfortable with, et cetera. So that it may indicate then that there really isn't a way to determine which employees have taken it or not. You will just kind of see how many have taken it in your organization. But to get the best answers possible, have it be optional and have it be anonymous, I think is ideal. So these, again, are on a later slide. Like I said, there's a link to 70 questions. So if you're feeling some of these questions, not others, and you may have already downloaded the PDF of the slides and you're already looking at that website, that's fine. But it's determining for your organization, what is the most important salient info I need? How do I ask these questions that are going to allow the staff to actually explain what they need, not just yes or no? So open-ended. So these are just, some of the questions to think about. But I think, it also is good for you too. How would I personally answer these questions for the workplace? And what would help me feel better? And then if someone's coming to you with concerns, maybe this is more of a in the moment response to a staff member who might be struggling, it's the same kind of strategy. What's something I can do right now that would be most helpful for you? That gives them space to answer you. Here's what would be most helpful to feel more supported around my mental health at work. And they'll give you and ask for measurables. What would be best? How can I assist in making you feel safe and supported? And all of those things. Sometimes people just need to hear, sounds really difficult. And I'm glad that you brought this to my attention. Let's talk about what we can do about it. And then things down here that we always want to be very mindful of. I bring up this bottom one talking about other employees. I really wish I could tell you how many times I've worked with human resources who have said, I met with one employee and I just told them, so-and-so who I talked to yesterday has not ever had any concerns about this. I'm like, all right, so let's talk a little bit about boundaries. So really making sure that, again, safety and psychological safety is also really tied up in boundaries and being mindful of that. And so when we are getting feedback from staff, it can be sometimes easy to just immediately jump into being like, well, other people don't think that, or this is what other people need. And it's really critical that people's boundaries are respected. And I know most of us know that, but it's just a reminder because of what I so often see and hear. And, really that safety piece is trust. And we will have more engagement the more employees feel like they can trust human resources and come to them with concerns. So bridging that gap is things like having healthy boundaries, asking better questions, following through, because that's the other thing too. Yeah, I'll look into that. Yep, okay, thanks for sharing. But then do you do anything about it? And that also is a really ongoing conversation I have with human resources is they're getting a lot of feedback and then it just kind of goes into the void. And that can be because doesn't feel like there's time to address it. But that starts creating this system of, I've talked about this, I've reported my concerns multiple times and nothing happened. And that's our role. That's, to actually do something about it. Does that mean that we can fix every single problem? Of course not. but we can follow through with what we can do and not just have it be thanks for sharing, moving on. So really trying to decide, what does genuine sort of measurable support look like? All right, implementation strategies. Here we go. My guess is probably most of you are familiar with what an employee assistance program is. Obviously, I'm from an employee assistance program, Cascade Centers, but there are multiple. So you may have us as an EAP, you may have a different employee assistance program. It is an excellent resource. I know I'm biased, but it's an excellent resource in terms of how to offer support to staff. So if they are struggling with mental health, if they're struggling with any type of stress, burnout, any issues in their life, we offer more than just mental health counseling. We offer financial coaching, legal consultations, because again, you may be asking some of these questions of staff and they may say, my biggest stressor is finances, and so if you have, an employee assistance program or resources that can help with financial coaching or those types of things, that's a way that you can provide a tangible resource to that employee and it's a free benefit to them. So of course, an EAP is always a great sort of immediate, concrete thing to consider if you don't already have one. And if you do, a lot of times HR will forget the scope of what EAP offers. It sort of gets reduced to just the mental health piece. But as we know, again, like I mentioned, a lot of things impact our mental health, and a lot of, our EAP at least provides, again, lots of different ways that we can support employees. And it's also completely confidential, of course. Another thing that you can do is with well-being apps and mental well-being apps, these are a few, some of them on this list are free, some are not, is offer a stipend and to pay for staff, if it's not a free app, to pay the cost of that app. So that can be something you can do as a team, as an organization. Here's the mental wellness app and we want everyone to have access to it. And so we will reimburse you the cost of that to utilize that app. So that is an easy way in terms of just a quick, measurable, how do we implement this? Because you may have already offered different services around physical well-being apps or step trackers, whatever it is, but there's, again, tons of apps for mental wellness too. So that can be something that you can offer. Let's see here. Looks like there's a question about EAPs. If our employees identify a support they need that's not provided by the EAP, are we able to discuss with Cascade implementation of new services? Yeah, if you ever have questions about some type of service or support that a staff member needs and it doesn't seem like it's something that the EAP currently offers, if we're your EAP, obviously, contact us, let us know what those needs are, and we can help with resources, we can help talk about ways that we can support. So my answer to any question like that is yes, call us, and we can work with you on how we can help with that type of service. So this could, again, the well-being apps could be a great way to have kind of team cohesion. You can, utilize those as a group, and it could be something you could help offer a stipend for. For this third one, mental health education and training, as you probably know already, we provide trainings. But again, if you have a different employee assistance program, they may offer trainings, or private companies offer trainings, and this is one example down here. But so often what I hear, and I hear this from HR a lot, is that, yeah, our leadership doesn't quite know how to handle mental health concerns in staff. And understandable, most people are not trained in that. And a lot of times in leadership, and I hear this a lot from leaders and from HR, is, a lot of the education I had around my current job didn't do a lot around the sort of the soft skills. So I know a lot about this piece of, knowledge in the area that I work in, but I have no idea what to do if an employee comes to me in a mental health crisis. I have no idea what to do if they are crying in my office. And that's very important. This also goes back to psychological safety. Staff figures out pretty quickly how comfortable leadership is with mental health issues. So the more that it is provided in terms of education, the more it's talked about. So if you have not already, I would suggest definitely considering not only continued training for human resources, definitely for leadership, but also for staff. And it sort of provides kind of an umbrella of resources for both. For HR and leadership, it provides more confidence and awareness and education around how do I support staff? What do I do? It helps with creating that psychological safety because they are sometimes less avoidant of talking about it, because if we don't know how to handle something, we tend to avoid talking about it, which then just reduces engagement, reduces psychological safety. But it's also important to teach staff about it, because what's that is doing is modeling to staff that you care about it, that you take it seriously, that you also want them to be educated about it. And so whether people are working remotely, you know, there's tons of remote trainings and there's tons of options for that. I would definitely, almost as much as my main takeaway, which is ask employees what they need. My second important one is more education for everyone. So that is a big one that you can implement. Employee resource groups, you may be familiar with those. If you joined later, under the handout section on the webinar interface, if you click on that little arrow next to handouts, you'll see something that says ERG Toolkit. You can download that. I found that one. I was looking at different ones online and which ones were most concise. I found that one very helpful because it has templates, it has step-by-step guides, it's got all of this stuff in there. So employee resource groups really are primarily most beneficial for larger organizations, and there can be different topics to those resource groups, but really what they can offer is that space for employees who may be interested in integrating wellness into the organization, and they want to do that in a way that they're engaged in. And in some ways, and I'll talk about wellness committees here in a moment, in some ways it's similar to that, but it's more structured. It's, again, there could be multiple ERGs for different topics, and that toolkit offers you a ton of resources on that. The thing that I think is really important to be aware of with ERGs, and I've seen this in a lot of organizations too, is if they are utilized, and maybe you already have them at your company, to be careful not to turn it into that group of staff are the ones who know about that, and the rest of us don't as much. With mental wellness and mental and emotional well-being, everyone needs to participate in that, participate in being educated in it, participate in promoting psychological safety. So they can be a team that helps with strategizing some kind of measurable interventions and providing additional resources, but it does not then, creating an ERG does not then allow the members who are not part of it, or the rest of employees who are not part of that ERG, to not have to think about it or not to have to educate themselves. And I bring that up again because that does happen sometimes. It sort of becomes this ability to kind of distance oneself from educating ourselves, and we definitely do not want to do that. There's also mental health first aid. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a nationwide certification, but this can be another thing that's really helpful, is to have one or more HR representatives trained in mental health first aid, or you can have one or more of individuals in leadership trained in that. And then, that can be something that employees are aware of, that you take this seriously, that you have people at the organization trained in this. Does that mean that you're suddenly their therapist? No, that is not what it's training you to be, but it is very helpful in terms of a specific measurable thing you can do to provide some of that support to staff. Other strategies to do with staff. So, some of this is kind of behind the scenes. What does HR do? What do leaders do? But then what are we offering in terms of wellness initiatives to staff specifically? So mindful pauses, that sounds very, of course, a counselor would tell us to do that, but I am a counselor, so there you go. Is a lot of times staff feel very burnt out, which can lead to disengagement, anxiety, and ultimately a lot of times apathy, which that is exactly what shows up when employees are disengaged. And we tend to have sometimes too busy of schedules. So a mindful pause can be something where either during a long meeting, and personally, I think it's hard to have a meeting longer than an hour in general, but that may not always be possible. You may have times where it needs to be longer than that. I totally understand. But allowing breaks, allowing times to stop and slow down. You can even do that during meetings. Everyone just do there's a million different breathing techniques. Take 30 seconds. I'm not saying take away all this time from an important meeting where a lot needs to be discussed. But when we slow down and sort of check ourselves for a moment, and one thing you can do, and we're all going to do it right now, obviously it's optional, but I would invite you to do it, is wherever you are, if you're sitting, standing, just drop your shoulders unclench your jaw, relax your face. And my guess is that most of us, all of those things were tense. So even if you just did that, just a quick check-in is like, how do we just slow down for a second and do a mindful pause? And when it's structured in that way, instead of like, let's all just take a moment, it just gives our brain something else to do. It resets, and then we can go back to that conversation. And when it's done consistently, it's not meant to imply, this, we only need to use it at these times. It's just embedded into our daily activities. I also think it can be helpful whenever possible to not have back-to-back meetings. Sometimes we need that pause between them, even if it's 5 minutes. So figuring out, how we structure those meetings for staff. Also, yoga, mindfulness sessions, and you may, of course, already know this too. There are tons available virtually. So I think, a lot of, like I mentioned earlier, some of the physical wellness initiatives, or maybe the mental, because I know a lot of you already, 88% of you are already integrating mental wellness initiatives. A lot of these may have just gone by the wayside during the pandemic. We're busy, everyone's workplace is different, but there are a lot of these things that we can still do if you have some or all remote workers, including things like yoga sessions or different mindfulness sessions. So participating in those, offering those are really important. Wellness committees, these are a little bit less structured than an official ERG, but the one good thing about that is that they can really be in any size organization. And ERGs and wellness committees, I think, are always best when they are optional and the people who are participating in them want to participate in them. So, considering, do we already have one? If we do, how have I checked in on how that's going, and how are our measurables with how that is it working and how it's structured right now? And then making that workplace more conducive to mental health. And these are things that you can talk about with staff. Again, ask them, what would it say staff are still working in person somewhere, whether it's an open floor plan, offices, maybe that's the case. So if we're thinking for this first bullet point, they're still on site, whatever that workplace looks like. Ask them the question, in terms of your workspace, like physical workspace, what are things that would help you feel that it was more conducive to your mental health? And ask them to list those things, not just, is it conducive to your mental health? Maybe they are under neon light, maybe it's just sort of white walls everywhere and there aren't natural plants around or ways that makes it more conducive to being in that space. Our physical space, and I think we know this, but sometimes we forget, makes an absolutely huge difference in our mental wellness, our ability to be present. And so there may be simple things that you can do. So that can be, ways to check in with staff, ways to implement physical space, emotional wellness, safety, and psychological safety. And then if it's remote, a lot of times organizations can offer a stipend, or we'll reimburse up to this much for items that you can add to your home workspace that can contribute to you feeling that that is a more emotionally, mentally conducive environment for you. So these, again, are some measurables that you can put into practice. This last one, there's a lot, and I don't have time today to talk about trauma-informed care, but part of it is really around employee voice and choice. And we've already talked about that a lot already today. That's my takeaway. But if you can allow any options for employees around flexible schedules, I realize that's not always possible, but anytime you can give an employee choice in something, it is going to help them feel more engaged. It is going to help them feel like they have more ownership, and that can help our mental well-being. If we're thinking about, this is kind of just one of the takeaway slides, because I do want to have some time for Q&A, is this can be something to check in with teams of staff. So if you are, say you do a survey, that's great, but you can also check in with your leaders about this. You can check in with employees about this, because these are different components of resilience. And if you're thinking, let's all, what are ways that we can improve mental wellness? What are strategies? Maybe as a team, we're going to work on one of these 6 per week. What does that look like for us as a team to be more self-aware? If we were all suddenly more self-aware, how would that change our team morale? How would that change our personal mental wellness? Maybe there's a piece that we need to improve connection. As we all know, that's been very impacted since the pandemic. Employees are feeling very isolated, which adds to anxiety. Are there things that you can implement into your wellness initiatives that really promote and drive more connection, even if that's virtual? Something to help people feel more connected to their peers. It goes a long way. Strength of character, mental agility. You can also talk about, what makes you want to go the extra mile at your job. Just literally ask them that, and how can we help you want to do that more? So these can be things that can be sort of a kicking off point for discussing this as groups and getting more feedback and kind of getting measurables around different strategies with the team. So I'd mentioned some community resources here before. Again, I think all of you are familiar with this now, that you can download this entire slide deck from the handouts tab here. This, as I'd mentioned earlier, is that link to those 70 questions to ask employees about mental health. This Mental Health America is an excellent website where they have a certification that an employer as a whole can be certified in mental health support. So they have tons of resources, not just the certification, but just one-off resources to help employers have concrete strategies to promote mental health and mental wellness in their organization. Calm is an app, but also has a ton of resources through their website for companies too. And then this last one is a crisis line and a mental health crisis support. So of course, if you have an employee assistance program, they can also assist in a crisis too. But if you do or don't, either way, it's still helpful. The more resources, the better. So this has just an immediate crisis line. The other thing too that is really helpful to remind employees of is that a lot of times when people are in emotional distress, and it's interesting kind of generationally too, is a lot of people are uncomfortable calling because that just creates anxiety. Who's going to answer the phone? Dialing the number can be a lot, and as HR, we want to try to create that bridge to resources, being the shortest bridge possible. So for many people, texting or live chatting feels more comfortable than talking on the phone. If you go to NAMI's website, or if that can be another thing to look into, and making sure that those resources are available and employees are aware of those. I can't tell you how often that can be a really helpful bridge for people to access resources more quickly because they can have some phone anxiety. So having those resources available is really helpful. Okay, so let's see here. Hold on. All right. I'm not skipping the questions, but I figured I'd just stay on the community resources slide since that's more interesting than looking at a slide that says questions. Okay, so someone had asked if there's a way of sharing your own mental health challenge as a way to encourage by setting an example. Great suggestion. And that always, I think, can be really helpful. One thing that has helped a lot for employees, kind of as we're talking about engaging with resources, is you can share, there's this level of vulnerability and boundaries. So what I have a lot of times, what HR will do, if someone comes to them, an employee comes to them and they're having issues with mental health, they'll say, again, say for example, you had an employee assistance program. I'm really glad that you brought this to my attention. I'm glad that you felt comfortable telling me this. We're here for you. I'm not sure if you are aware that you have a confidential resource, which is the employee assistance program that provides free mental health services. I've used it before and found it very helpful for me. It was really easy to access. So you are speaking from your own experience and providing that level of vulnerability, but you don't necessarily have to go into why you contacted them. So sometimes that can be an appropriate bridge where it doesn't turn into a whole long personal story about you, just with boundaries, making sure you're focusing on their needs, but you're also sharing an experience and helping them, know that, number one, destigmatizing, because you're willing to say, yep, I've needed that resource before too. So there's that empathy piece. And so that sometimes can be a really helpful way to engage that conversation and share some of that vulnerability and modeling, essentially. Because again, we can say, everyone be, emotionally healthy, everyone be engaged, everyone do all these things. But if we want the people at our organization to do that, we have to model that. If we want them to be able to tolerate distress, be resilient. Are we modeling those skills to them? Because I see a lot, leaders or HR will ask their employees to be those things, and they aren't quite there yet. So it has to start with us. We have to model that if we're asking them to meet us there, essentially. So that's my tangent off of that question that you asked, but that was an excellent question, so I appreciate that. Let's see here if there's any other questions that people have. I do know, sometimes a question will come up about certificates. You'll get a certificate sent to you in the next few days for attendance to this as well. So just wanted to make sure, pre-answer that question, some logistical. But I think, we'll give it another few moments here if there's any other questions, but as I'm just kind of waiting to see our information here, I'll just kind of provide that here real quick. Again, we're an employee assistance program. Maybe you have us as your EAP, but that's our phone number, that's our website on there. If you do have any questions, if you don't have an EAP, obviously give us a call if you're interested in more information. But either way, I think everyone's under a lot of stress, and hopefully there are concrete, immediate takeaways that you can utilize from this. That was my goal. That and ask them what they need. So there you go. That's my final suggestion. What are my measurables? How would I know things had improved? And I'm going to start with asking staff what they need. And that may be, that opens a can of worms, but that's the only way we can make actual real impact and lasting impact. So it does take more work, as does anything with real results, but it really does make a difference in our organization. All right, so I don't see any other questions. I really, really, really appreciate everybody's participation today, everybody's participation in the polls, your wonderful, excellent questions. If you do need anything, if you have questions about EAP through us, certainly let us know, and you'll get your certificates soon. So hopefully you have a wonderful, safe rest of your week, and thanks so much for attending today, and take care.